Hello everybody, thanks Giselle Jackson, CPA here. I have an important update for you regarding the PPP, which is the Paycheck Protection Program, and the EIDL program, which is the Emergency Injury Disaster Loan Program. So Congress, as I'm sure some of you have heard, on Friday, actually the president on Friday signed into law the next tranche on the Paycheck Protection Program and the EIDL loan programs in terms of some additional funding to help out small businesses. So Congress passed it, the House passed it on Thursday, and then the president signed it on Friday. So those funds will now officially become available to go out for these programs. So what it was that they passed was $310 billion of additional funds for the Paycheck Protection Program, and a $60 billion of that is allocated specifically to community banks. So those are typically going to be the banks that really service smaller businesses, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, and smaller businesses that don't usually have a good banking relationship with a large national bank. Those are also banks that tend to be willing to accept new applications. So from people who have not had a bank account with them or a loan relationship with them in the past, they tend to be willing to accept those. So this is a good opportunity for some of the smaller businesses to really go and get some of these PPP funds to help their business out during this time period. But we're going to talk a little bit later on in this video about why you may not want the Paycheck Protection Program loan, because you could potentially get some more benefits from other avenues. So banks were instructed, just so you know, to process first the loans that were previously submitted. And I saw a stat out there somewhere, I don't know if it's factual or not, but about $1 trillion worth of Paycheck Protection Program applications are already out there and kind of in the queue. And so chances are, if you haven't submitted an application by now, chances are, even if you go and submit one on Monday or Tuesday of next week, you may not honestly get it unless they appropriate more funds and maybe like a third tranche or something like that, which I'm kind of hearing is potentially unlikely. They would do a third tranche, but anything's possible. So yeah, I mean, if you think this could definitely help you, I mean, and you have the information necessary, you can certainly go ahead and apply for it. I just would not necessarily get your hopes up, unfortunately. They also released some brand new guidance on Friday related to the certification of a certain statement that you have to certify on the application for the PPP program. So on that certification, it clarifies that when you make a certification that says uncertainty makes this loan necessary to support the ongoing operations of the business. So everybody that applies for the Paycheck Protection Program loan has to make that certification. So they came out to clarify that if you basically on your current activity, let's say you have a lot of cash in the bank, and let's say that you have access to some additional capital, and maybe you were just applying for this because it was essentially quote unquote free money that they were kind of giving away. It sounds like they're going to stick their teeth into this a little bit more and potentially even ask, when you go for the forgiveness, what made it so uncertain that you needed the loan. It's very possible they might actually ask those questions. So you really want to consider whether you truly need the loan or not. Obviously, if you were operating and your business got completely shut down, right? Okay, I think that's a pretty clear and cut case potentially. That said, if you have backing from a big investor, like let's say you got $1 billion investor that is one of your owners, that may potentially hurt you in that certification. A lot of the issues I think from this have stemmed from the public companies. As you've probably heard in the news and media lately, there's been a lot of public companies that have received these loans. These companies have millions and millions of dollars of revenues each year, millions of dollars of market capitalization. So I think that's where the heart of this is trying to get at, is to stop those public companies from applying for these loans. because it really wasn't intended for them. It was really intended for the mom and pop small business that usually doesn't have access to capital, is what these are typically intended for. Other businesses that usually have that access and that ability to go get funds from other sources like their billionaire investors or the public market, issue debt, that kind of stuff. These really weren't for them, and so they're trying to stick their teeth into it and try to get these companies to stop doing it. And if they did do it and they maybe shouldn't have, they're giving you basically until May 7th to return the money. And if you do that, they're not going to come after you for some sort of false certification. There is very strict penalties and fines if they find that you did make a false certification on the application. And so it is a risk that you're taking. You know, if you have money in the bank and you know you have access to capital, and you know you don't necessarily need this to make your payroll, and you don't necessarily need this to fund your operations and pay your bills, you could potentially get yourself into a jam down the line. So that's just the one word of caution I'll give everybody on this program. That said, I mean, it is still a very subjective, you know, certification. I mean, there's no bright line test. I really wish they would have came out with the bright line test, like maybe you had a 50% reduction in revenues, or you had, you know, you basically have no dollars in the bank account, or some kind of, you know, bright line test to really make sure that people qualify for this. But they didn't do that. So it's going to be very subjective, and it'd be interesting to see how it all plays out in the courts. And, you know, because obviously I'm sure there might be some lawsuits that come from this whole thing. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out, unfortunately. But hopefully, you know, we get to the heart of this program, and, you know, we get people that are doing it that truly, truly need it. So one thing I'll also say is if you have employees who you were paying less than $20 per hour, there's a decent chance that they could actually make more on unemployment. As I mentioned in a previous video, they're basically giving people that are on unemployment an extra $600 per week. So on top of the normal state benefits, which from what I've read can range, you know, up to maybe like $300 per week or $400 per week in some cases. So, I mean, there's some people who could be getting $1,000 a week in payments from the unemployment side of things, and you know you're paying a minimum wage of maybe $15 or $14, whatever it is in your state. I mean, they could very well be making less by you paying them than they would on unemployment. That said, if they're getting health insurance benefits and stuff like that, I think that kind of skews that a little bit, and definitely makes sense to, you know, try to bring them back from that perspective. But if it's just a matter of you giving them their hourly wage, there's been some articles where companies have gotten these loans and their employees basically didn't even want to come back to work because they were making more money on unemployment. So just something to consider and think about, you know, as you're going through this. You know, the fact that you don't get it may honestly not even be the worst situation for your employees potentially. So something to consider. The banks are basically going to start taking applications and submitting those to the SBA on Monday, April 27th, which is in 2 days here at 10:30 a.m. Eastern time. So that's when the banks can start submitting applications to the Small Business Administration again to get approvals for these loans. I expect that they're going to be slammed again to try to get all these done and approved. So there will definitely be a backlog. But if you haven't gotten your application in and you still want to, definitely go ahead and do that. There's other companies that have came into the program like PayPal and QuickBooks that I would recommend that you go to if you haven't already submitted your application to a big bank. Main reason being is they may not have quite as many applications because most people were submitting things to the big banks, and so a lot of people are in the queue with the big banks. So chances are if you submit your application through PayPal or QuickBooks, you might get a response quicker and you might get submitted quicker than if you were to go to one of the big banks at this point. So if you still want to go ahead and apply for it, I would definitely recommend that. or a community bank. Again, there's $60 billion that was set aside for community banks, and let's say you meet the criteria for like minority owned or women owned business at one of these CDFIs or community banks, you may want to go ahead and try that instead of your normal big bank if you have one of those. They also released some additional guidance on calculating the self-employed person, so sole proprietorship, and the partnership amount that you're eligible to borrow under the Paycheck Protection Program. So what they basically said there is, it's based off of your net income. So the income that's subject to self-employment taxes on either your Schedule C or on Form 1065 for the partnership, that's the income that you're going to ultimately be eligible to get a loan for. So let's say, for example, you made $30,000 of net income for 2019 in your sole proprietorship or your partnership, either one. Your maximum loan amount would only be $6,250, which is basically $30,000 divided by 12 times 2.5. Okay, so that's how they determine your maximum loan amount. I mean, ultimately, you very well could get more if you were to go on to unemployment, especially if you're a partnership and you only made $30,000 for the partnership. Each of you on unemployment could potentially get more than if you were to do the Paycheck Protection Program. So something to think about, and to consider. The maximum amount of net profit that you can include is $100,000 if you're a sole proprietor, and $100,000 per partner in a partnership. So, if your partnership was making, $100,000 a year between two partners, then that's $50,000 for each of you. If it was making $300,000 a year for two partners, the most you can take is $100,000. So just keep that in mind as well. That's going to limit the amount that you can qualify for. Chances are, though, if you were making that much money in your partnership or sole proprietorship and you were doing your taxes and tax planning correctly, you should probably be an S corporation anyways, to where you'd be able to apply for it as a W-2 employee and do the more typical standard process for the Paycheck Protection Program. To get the loan as a sole proprietor or a partnership, you're going to have to basically give them a copy of your 2019 Schedule C as documentation. And for a partnership, you're going to have to give them a copy of your 1065 tax return as a documentation. In addition, you're going to have to give them a bank statement or a P&L or something like that from your financials for the first quarter of 2020, which basically will show that you were in business as of February 15th of 2020. So you have to prove that you were in business as of that date. So that's some additional documentation you're going to have to give them. I would also, just remind you that, there's a couple different options that are available to you. You could do the employee retention program. You could do the Paycheck Protection Program. The employee deferral program for the payroll taxes. You could do, so again, to clarify, employee retention program or the payroll tax deferral program. I did a video on those last week. Those are definitely options that are still available to you if it doesn't quite make sense for you to do the Paycheck Protection Program. And those options are available even, once you start your business back up, as long as you qualified for them initially. So once you actually have some revenues coming in. So you really have to kind of do an analysis of all the different programs to figure out which one would make the most sense from you. It believe it or not, is still a tax strategy. There's still some strategies to it to, figure out the most financially beneficial aspect to your business and to your employees. So we have to kind of, you really have to kind of do an analysis to really figure out what makes the most sense. The EIDL loan applications should be coming available, I think, sometime next week, unless they have already basically allocated all those additional funds to people who previously applied, which could very well be possible. I'm not sure, how far they got through the previous applications, but there's a possibility that there may not even be an opportunity to get the EIDL loan advance, even with the new funding. So all in all, a lot of changes that happened. I'm glad that they finally put some more money into it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Information is on the website, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks, bye.